For many Michigan families, owning a home represents stability and security. For families with bad or no credit, or for low-income families of color, securing a mortgage can be an insurmountable challenge. In some cases, a land contract can be a realistic path to home ownership, allowing buyers to purchase a home without a traditional mortgage. Thousands of Michigan families rely on this option. According to the Pew Charitable Trust, from 2005 to 2022, Michigan led the nation in publicly recorded land contracts. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago found that of the more than 400,000 recorded contracts in the nation, 25% of them are in Michigan, and about a quarter of those are in Detroit and Wayne County. Unfortunately, many of these land contracts are used in predatory and exploitative ways, resulting in financial loss, damaged credit, and worse, evictions, leaving families homeless. Today on Legally Speaking, our guests will explain land contracts, explore their risks and benefits, and provide expert insights to help you understand what you need to know about land contracts in Michigan. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Legally Speaking. I'm Ashley Lowe, the Chief Executive Officer of Lakeshore Legal Aid. We're a nonprofit law firm that provides free civil legal services to people living with low incomes, older adults, and survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence throughout Michigan. Today we're talking with two experts on land contracts. I'd like to introduce our first guest, Joon Sung. Joon is the Systemic Advocacy Director at Lakeshore Legal Aid, and he is a longtime legal aid attorney. He has spent his time at Legal Aid focusing on representing survivors of or victims of consumer fraud, mortgage foreclosure, and victims of unscrupulous landlords. He's also been a clinical law professor at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School, where he led the Veterans Law Clinic and the Mortgage Foreclosure Defense Clinic, trying to keep Detroit families in their homes during the Great Recession. Joon, I'm so glad you could join us today.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
And our next guest is Evie Zwiebach. Evie is a director at the Enterprise Community Partners, where she works to help increase affordable home ownership, affordable and tenant protections. Evie is also a co-author of a policy brief with the University of Michigan Poverty Solutions on land contracts, and has written a land contract buyer guide for Detroiters. She also oversees the Detroit Home Repair Fund, which provides low-income Detroiters who are homeowners with emergency repairs. And Evie has been working for over 15 years to improve equitable communities, and we're just so grateful to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, let's start with Joon. Joon, talk about your work as the Systemic Advocacy Director at Lakeshore. What do you do?
Absolutely. So I work with a team of attorneys, and we help to identify common problems that exist in the community. So the problems that many people would experience, and what we try to do is not only represent individuals who are having those problems, but try to design and implement different advocacy strategies so that we're able to stop that problem in the future. So we call that often impact litigation. But in addition to litigation, there's other strategies that we employ. We're out there in the community with community lawyering, education, and we also try to educate the community through media advocacy as well.
Great. And so do you see a lot of land contracts in your work?
We do. Unfortunately, we do have many individuals in the community who contact us. Unfortunately, at the time that they're facing land contract forfeiture or eviction. So they're facing court cases where the land contract sellers are seeking to evict them from property. We're also seeing these issues as we go out and identify some of these problems that we see going on. So we try to identify some of the bad actors and some of the unscrupulous practices and try to stop those practices from happening.
Got it. So what do land contracts look like? What's different from a land contract versus a mortgage that someone might use to buy their home?
Yeah, so most people, they're not able to buy property just with a cash purchase. Very few of us have money to do that. The traditional financing vehicle to purchase homes is, of course, a mortgage. So individuals would typically seek to purchase a house, and to finance that, they get a third party, typically a bank or a credit union, to loan that money, and they sign a mortgage indicating that if they don't pay back this money, that the mortgage company retains a lien and can try to foreclose on it. So it's a third-party seller financing. A land contract is different in that it's not a third party that's financing the transaction, but it is the seller who is indicating that I am loaning you the money so that you can buy the property from me, and I, as the buyer, agree to make monthly payments, and only after all of the payments are made is the deed transferred. So that's really significant in terms of how the transaction is structured. In a mortgage, the deed goes to the buyer immediately at the time of sale. In a land contract, the buyer only receives the title and the deed only after all of the payments are made.
So it could be many years before they see that title after they've entered into this land contract.
That's right.
Got it. And who are the typical sellers? Are they individual homeowners? Is that who normally enters into these land contracts?
Typically what we've seen are companies who buy properties that are often purchased at foreclosure sales, tax foreclosures, commercial entities. So these are companies that are set up to purchase and sell properties typically to low-income buyers. The big problem has been, especially in the city of Detroit, that it's difficult for individuals to purchase homes through typical mortgages. So they're turning to these type of transactions and to these companies to try to purchase the homes.
And what's the risk? What's the risk to the buyers in using a land contract?
Yeah, so when individuals purchase homes through a mortgage, there's usually built-in safeguards that are put in by the mortgage companies to make sure that the people who are purchasing these properties are purchasing properties that they can reasonably pay. There's often maximums in terms of debt-to-income ratios that are calculated. And also, the mortgage companies mandate certain inspections to be done. So if the property doesn't meet certain conditions, that property won't be approved for the mortgage. In addition, there's also appraisals that are done so that the property that is being purchased, that the price is fair. The problem
So somebody
with
outside of those two parties is looking at the property and saying, this is the appropriate price here.
Exactly.
Okay.
And in the land contract context, it's totally the buyer beware. There's no third parties that are making sure that this is a good transaction, that the person is buying a property that is fair in price and something that is not expected to result in forfeiture later on.
Got it. Thanks. Evie, let's talk a little bit about your work. Tell me what you do with the Enterprise Community Partners.
Yeah, so I'm a director in Enterprise Community Partners Detroit office. Enterprise is a national nonprofit focused on affordable housing and community development, and we have market offices across the country. So Detroit is one of those, and in my role, I oversee programs and policy work, state and local policy specifically. So, as you mentioned in your introduction, I oversee our Detroit Home Repair Fund initiative. And some other home repair work that provide critical health and safety repairs to low-income homeowners. But I've also been doing work in the policy space and research and advocacy focused on land contracts. And so began this work several years ago, collaborating with University of Michigan Poverty Solutions, and have been doing some research as to how we can make land contracts a safer tool for people in Michigan, and following up with a couple different resources, and now thinking about state legislation that could help codify some of these reforms.
Got it. So why are land contracts so prevalent in the city of Detroit and Michigan?
Yeah. So, Joon began to touch on it, but they tend to be most common in places where people don't have access to traditional mortgage financing. And that lack of access is due to multiple different factors. It can be people's incomes and debt-to-income ratios that you need to qualify. It might be related to credit scores. People have damaged credit or no credit in some cases. it's often related to the value of the home. It's really hard to get small value mortgages, any mortgage for less than $150,000. Those are more limited offerings from banks. And then finally, it has to do with the condition of a home. So can a home pass inspection? And we know, kind of touching back with what I was just sharing about the home repair, there's significant need for home repair. There's a lot of deferred maintenance in homes, and many homes would not pass an inspection, and so you could not get a mortgage to purchase it. And so people use alternative financing like land contracts.
So without the land contract, there might just not be any way to purchase a home for somebody.
That's right. I think it really is one of the few pathways available, and data on the prevalence of land contracts can be tricky to obtain for various reasons that we'll probably touch on, but there have been multiple points where based off of our best data, we see that there are more land contracts than mortgage originations in Detroit.
And why is the data so tricky? What makes it hard?
Yeah, it has to do with the lack of recordation requirements. And so when a land contract is signed, there isn't actually any requirement that that transaction is publicly recorded with a register of deeds. And so some buyers and sellers do choose to record that, and that's a great choice because it helps protect both parties and make sure there's a public record of what's been agreed to. But there is no requirement for that. And in many cases, the land contracts are not recorded. And in many cases, buyers are not even given a paper copy of the contract of what they agreed to and what they signed. So there's really no record of the terms of the agreement or the transaction. And so there's a bit of a sense where we have data on recorded land contracts, but it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg. We don't know quite just how big that iceberg is because we don't have recordation data. That's universal, but certainly with what we do have, it shows that they're very prevalent.
Got it. And so if they're not recorded, then if somebody wants to enforce it, then there's it's got to be all kinds of issues around that, right? There's a he said, she said
exactly.
on what the terms are.
Yeah, there's it leads to a lot of problems around enforcement when there's a dispute between the buyer and the seller. And it open it up for predatory practices where a buyer and a seller agree to something, but then the seller changes up a condition or hasn't revealed all of the conditions that they had been in planning on including.
Right. So it sounds like there's problems with it, but people need it, right? If they're looking at a home that's less than $150,000 and they don't have credit, what are some of the guardrails? What's needed to make sure that land contracts aren't abused and are actually helpful for people who are in those circumstances?
Yeah, I think a couple of the things that are really important and that emerged from our research where we were actually able to see how nonprofits and mission-driven organizations were using land contracts in a positive way. We learned a lot about, the sort of the supportive and kind of proactive things that can be done to make these safer transactions. And so some of that is removing the mismatch of information that the buyer and the seller have, or the information asymmetry, where usually the seller knows a whole lot more about the property and is setting the terms of the transaction. And so having really clear contract terms, recording that contract, like I said, making a record of that, but having important information like the address. It's pretty basic, but it's often not in there. What is the interest rate? What is the term? Are there balloon payments? Who's responsible for paying the property taxes? Does the buyer have the right to make repairs in the home or make improvements in the home? All of those are things that really need to be spelled out. And the other thing that is a common issue in Detroit and elsewhere is disclosure around any title issues or liens. Right now, there's no title search that happens. That's a typical process in a mortgage transaction, and it helps make sure that the buyer is actually buying something that the seller is going to legally be able to transfer them if they are successful. So we recommend at best title insurance, but at a minimum that there be a title search done in advance so that the buyer really has information. Are there back taxes on this property? Is it about to go into tax foreclosure? Are there other liens or other things that might prevent them from being successful? And what has been uncovered in Detroit is that sometimes the seller is not actually the owner too. And that's the kind of thing that might come up in a title search, where so the seller is purporting to have the right to sell it to you, but they don't actually own the property.
Similar to other circumstances, I think we see at legal aid where there's a landlord who purports to own the property
exactly.
but doesn't.
Yeah, so you see that with land contracts too.
Right, so requiring or encouraging a title search would be protective of the buyers.
That's right.
Okay. And so you've talked about kind of mission-driven organizations that might do these land contracts to help. Is there a private market that works where individual sellers might use land contracts? Could that still work even if it's a private entity?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as I said, we don't have really clear information as to the extent of this market, but there has been some new research done by Pew, which has helped illuminate a little bit about the dynamics. And one of the really interesting things that they've seen in studying recorded land contracts in Michigan is that there's a really high percentage of individual sellers. So like Joon was saying, there are private companies, and they, not to paint with a broad brushstroke, but many of those are the ones who are not necessarily taking all the pains to make this as a clear contract as possible. Sometimes there are things that should be proactively done to really help even the playing field, and then there's sometimes, I think, omissions that are really setting the buyer back. And kind of there's a spectrum of how these contracts are structured, but there are a number of individual sellers, and as well as nonprofits who might do this again to fill a gap. And the nonprofits that we spoke to had really high success rates for transferring the property and people being able to become owners. And in some of the studies that Pew has done, they've also found that relatively high rates of success associated with some of these individual sellers and people's buyers reporting overall, yeah, we were able to buy the home, and we would do this again. So I think the recordation requirement is super important for buyers and sellers and individual transactions, but for the broader field, for legal advocates, for community development practitioners, real estate practitioners, understanding actually how this market is working would better help us make it more effective and have there be a successful transaction between buyers and sellers. And so recordation is the building block for all of that. That really helps us understand who are the sellers, who are the buyers, how often do land contracts end in home ownership for the buyer, and if not, why not?
Got it. Then that helps you with your data to better analyze, is this a good tool?
Yeah,
and
and what's needed? What's needed to make it more successful? Because like you say, they are filling a gap. And so what we should do is just make them safer and make them more effective at actually helping provide a realistic path to home ownership. And we have some sense of how to do that, but there's more to learn.
I think there's a really significant difference in terms of those successful land contracts that result in title going to the buyer between those land contracts that are drafted and sold, properties that are sold by nonprofits like Evie mentioned. We have seen significant problems with those instances where there is that lack of transparency and disclosure of information. So Evie pointed out that one of the main problems is that buyers often lack information in terms of what they're actually getting into. You have this commercial entity that has all of the information, that's very experienced, and the buyer typically in these transactions are individuals that have never owned a home before. So they feel like this is my path to home ownership and the American dream. So they're often so excited about that, They don't think about how they're going to be making the payments on this. Is this a good deal? Is what I'm buying worth actually what I'm purchasing for? And in addition to the monthly payments that are required, can I afford the other incidental expenses that go along with owning a home? So not only do you have the monthly payments that are being made, but you're also looking at property taxes, you're looking at home insurance, then you're also looking on top of that, expenses that are going to be required to actually make that home into a home. So these might be substantial repair issues that they sometimes may not even be aware of, that they have to repair. In addition to that, the other normal repair and incidentals that go along with repairing a home as well. So often those costs are substantially more than the monthly payments that are required, and failure to take that into account results in substantial problems, including the loss of the money that they've put into the home if the home is in fact forfeited and they can't make the payments.
And so if a couple things you said there stood out to me. One is that even though the title hasn't changed hands, they're still, the buyers under land contracts are still responsible for paying taxes and getting insurance on the home. And then also those repairs. So if they don't end up getting the transfer of the title at the end of a land contract, is that money just gone that they've put into the home?
Often that's the case. So unlike a mortgage transaction, the home can be forfeited, which means that the seller can simply take back the property. That's different than a mortgage, in which if there is an unfortunate instance of a foreclosure, the homeowner can still reap the equity that may be in the home, the amounts that they paid in.
Right. So have you dealt with some of these cases at Legal Aid, Joon, that maybe you could share some stories about the work that you've done?
Absolutely. So not only do we represent individuals at the time they're facing the loss of the home, but we're also looking at addressing the problem actors, those companies that are engaging in the deceptive practices. And something that we found is that although these companies may be pitching these transactions as sales, they even may use the term land contract, the documents they were drafting were actually called leases, and leases with an option to purchase. So it had all of the characteristics of a land contract, meaning that they promised that the individual would receive title at the end of this transaction. There would be a monthly amount that would be paid, a final purchase price, but it was drafted up as a lease so that if the payments weren't made, they could simply ask the court to evict the individuals without even the protection that would normally be afforded to land contracts.
So kind of the worst of both worlds.
That's right. That's right. And what we found was, because of this deception, that very few of these transactions resulted in the buyer receiving title to the property. So we were able to address this issue against three of some of the biggest actors, so that they agreed to stop these transactions, and if the properties were actually being sold on land contract, to call it a land contract and to change the terms. So we were successful in that result, and that not only addressed the issue for people who purchase the homes with these agreements, we're able to get those agreements changed, but to stop that practice from happening in the future as well.
Oh, great. That's great to hear. So either of you maybe can talk about, if we've talked about there are problems, and that also there are really good reasons to use a land contract. If somebody wants to enter into a land contract, what should they do? What are the most important things that they should know before they do that?
So I can start with that. So similar to, let's say you're buying something that is significant in terms of price. Let's say you're going out and buying a TV. I think you would be doing some comparisons shopping. Is this a good deal? Can I afford it? And same type of analysis that the buyer should be undergoing when they're seeking to purchase on land contract. Can they afford it? Is this a good deal? and how can I receive title to this property in the future? So determine if this is a good deal. An appraisal is something that is really important because it's a third party coming in to assess what is this property truly worth. Typically in these transactions, it's the seller saying, this is the price. And the buyer doesn't know because they're not a sophisticated actor as to whether this is a good deal or not. Second, I think it's really important to do an analysis of the income and whether they can afford the expenses that go into the home. Not only just the payment that needs to be made, but also take into account the taxes and insurance. And because many of these homes need substantial repair, can I afford the repairs? So there are those anticipated costs that someone should know about, but also there should be a portion that's set aside for those unanticipated costs as well.
Right, right. Well, Joon and Evie, I appreciate you sharing all this information. I think we know there's a lot of people in our area who are looking at this as a way to actually purchase a home, maybe their first home. And I think these kind of guardrails of what buyers should do and to protect themselves are really important. Evie, I know you've done a buyer's guide and would love to provide that information to our viewers so that where can they find that buyer's guide?
Yeah, it's a great resource, and it helps walk people through step by step what they should be thinking about at every stage. So if you're already in a land contract and hadn't had a chance to review some of this information, there's still things that you can do to protect yourself. Or if you're at the beginning of the process, it helps walk through some of the questions that Joon outlined. So it's available at the City of Detroit's website. You can search City of Detroit land contract information or land contract help, and it'll take you there. Some of the information is specific to Detroit and Wayne County in terms of, well, where do you register, record your land contract, but most of the laws governing land contracts right now are at the state level, so it is applicable to people across Michigan for the most part, and so it's a great resource. And we also cite and refer to other services that people might be able to access to learn more. So I definitely recommend looking into that. We have a couple checklists and kind of worksheets that people can do really to just kind of make sure at each step that they've really thought things through and understand what questions they need to ask. Like Joon was saying, I think in a traditional mortgage transaction, you have a third party, and that third party puts all these mechanisms in place to really protect their interest with title insurance and appraisals and things like that. With seller financing, it's just the buyer and the seller, and so it becomes incumbent on the buyer to basically do those things to protect themselves.
Right.
And that's what this buyer guide helps people understand. Well, I should do a title search. I need to maybe get an appraisal. I need to do my own budgeting analysis. I'm not going to have a third party come and tell me, can I afford it? I need to figure out if I can afford it. And so how they can best protect themselves as they're considering a really significant purchase.
Great. Well, I know it's a great resource. And so I just want to thank both of you for being here today and joining me on Legally Speaking. And thanks to you for joining us on Legally Speaking and hearing all about this great information on land contracts. Have a good day.